Coming to the next question, Centaur's criteria is used for the diagnosis of, okay, so this is used for the diagnosis of bacterial pharyngitis. But why is it important? Because of antibiotic prescriptions. If we start giving antibiotics for all upper respiratory tract infections and suspected pharyngitis, this could lead to significant antibiotic abuse and increase the antibiotic resistance of the colonizing bacteria. However, if we do not give antibiotics to any of the patients with upper respiratory tract infection, we may miss important infections, bacterial pharyngitis infections, and the patients can have antecedent systemic as well as local complications. So how do we decide? And there comes, to our aid, the Center's criteria. In the Center's criteria, we have 1, absence of cough. 2nd, presence of fever. 3rd, anterior tender cervical lymphadenopathy. And 4th is tonsillar exudates on examination. Okay, so these are the 4 criteria which are present for for Centaur's criteria. 4 parameters used in Centaur's criteria. If the score is more than 2, you consider antibiotic, or you consider strep testing. Depending on the situation, you do either of these. Okay. If the score is 1 or 2, only you do not give antibiotics and avoid antibiotic overuse and abuse. Okay. Which of the following is not a cause for pre-renal AKI? Again, this is not a difficult question to answer. Diuretic use, hepatorenal syndrome, cardiorenal syndrome, these are pre-renal AKIs. Okay. Mind you, hepatorenal syndrome, if you're talking about HRS in patients with cirrhosis, okay, this is a kind of pre-renal AKI. This is not a renal AKI. Okay, this is a pre-renal one. Diuretic use causes volume depletion and causes an AKI, or rather can worsen an existing acute kidney injury if the patient is also hypovolemic at the baseline. Cardiorenal syndrome again can be of various types. There are 5 types of cardiorenal syndromes, most of which are having a pre-renal etiology. NSAID-induced nephropathy is usually interstitial nephritis. And it is a variety of intrinsic AKI. So this is the diagnosis. Okay. Okay, now we change to the next question. Which of the following presentation portends a serious underlying etiology? Interesting one. So we have various case scenarios. We'll start from the D. So we have a 20-year-old healthy female who presents with crampy lower abdominal pain 1 day prior to her menses. So this is a typical menstrual cramp. Okay, it does not underlie a serious etiology. However, a possibility of an ectopic pregnancy must be there, especially if the patient has a history of missed menses or an abdominal pain, abdominal tenderness, any syncope or vital signs abnormality. Okay, then a possibility of an ectopic pregnancy should be considered. Otherwise, this looks like a menstrual cramp. So this is out of question. A 28-year-old female with a history of analgesic abuse now presents with an upper abdominal burning pain and vomiting. which is relieved on analgesics and antiemetics again. So I hope this is not the NSAID analgesic, this is an opioid analgesic. Okay, so this typically looks like a peptic ulcer disease or a gastritis which is responsive to medical therapy. So this does not portend a serious diagnosis again. A 30-year-old female with a history of renal stones now presents with the right flank pain radiating to the groin. So this is a typical presentation of a ureteric colic, and the patient has already a previous history of renal stones. So this presentation would likely be because of her renal stones itself, and most cases would not even require an imaging in the emergency department. Okay, if the diagnosis is quite straightforward. So this is not a serious diagnosis at all. This can be treated and it's well responsive to analgesics, and then the patients can be discharged. Coming to the first one, a 50-year-old hypertensive male presenting with abdominal pain, low back pain for 28 to 48 hours. So this is an important, important clinical presentation. We need to discuss about it. So there are various red flags here. Okay. So first is a 50-year-old hypertensive. This is slightly at a higher end. So this is an old person. So this is an elderly. Hypertensive male. This is another point. Low back pain. So if we consider low back pain as one of the presenting complaints here, red flags include: one is old age, second is presence of hypertension, third is an abdominal pain radiating to back, and this patient has all the three. Okay, and when this is present, this is a typical presentation of an abdominal aortic aneurysm. And since the patient is acutely symptomatic, a rupture must always be considered. Okay, so this is the answer. This is a serious diagnosis and serious etiology, and expedited treatment should be considered in such a patient. Hence the diagnosis is A. We come to the next question now. Which of the following depicts a process unrelated to gallstone disease? Okay. Now, here we have 4 named triads or conditions, and we have to find out which of the following is not related to a gallstone disease. Wriggler's triad is defined for gallstone ileus, and this refers to presence of obstruction, ectopic location of gallstone on imaging, and third is presence of pneumobilia. This constitutes Wriggler's triad and is associated with gallstone disease. For the next one, for the Murphy's triad, this is seen in acute pancreatitis. Acute appendicitis. Okay, so Murphy's sign is seen in cholecystitis. But Murphy's triad is seen in acute appendicitis, and it constitutes vomiting, anorexia, and abdominal pain. Okay, this is typical for acute appendicitis. Charcot's triad is for acute cholangitis and is fever, jaundice, and right upper quadrant pain. Okay, so this is again related to gallstone. Hence, the answer is Murphy's triad. What is Mirizi syndrome? If we have gallbladder, this is cystic duct here, and hepatic duct, common bile duct here. Okay, so we have stone here, it is not a problem. But if you have got a stone in the Hartmann's pouch or the neck or in the early part of cystic duct, it can externally compress the common hepatic duct or a common bile duct. Okay, this can externally compress it, causing an obstructive jaundice. Okay, so this is called Mirizi syndrome. Again, which is related to gallstones. So the answer is Murphy's triad. Okay. So now come to the next question, which is a very important question again, as far as the emergency medicine is concerned, as we do a lot of point of care ultrasound or bedside ultrasound, which is the following image on lung ultrasound of a patient is possible. Possible diagnosis could be all except. As you can see the picture here, you can vaguely see a lot of bright lights going on from this. There's one line here from which a lot of bright lights are going down and going to the base of the screen. Okay, so for that, to understand this, let's discuss about various aspects of lung ultrasound. Okay, first of all, how does normally lung looks is that if you use a linear probe, so there are various probes in the ultrasound. This is a linear probe which has a linear footprint. This is how the ultrasound waves are transmitted and received, and the type of image which we get is a square image. A convex probe or a curvilinear probe is one which has a curved footprint and it gives out and emits and receives waves this way, and we get a curvilinear footprint on the image. So this is how we get the image shape. Okay, so in the question we saw this is a shape which we get here. Okay, so this is a curvilinear probe which was used, right? Okay, so normally what we see is a rib followed by a pleural line followed by a rib. So bone is a bad conductor of ultrasound. Bad for ultrasound are bone and air. Okay, so bone, we will be able to see only the anterior cortex of the bone and followed by a dark area of suggesting that this is bone. We'll see a pleural line and again we'll see a bone. Okay, that is a rib again. Beyond this, everything would be an artifact because this is full of air. There is lung here, there is air here, and anything which we get in this area would be an artifact. This pleural line moves. Okay, this moves with respiration. There is a movement which is known as lung sliding. So the lung sliding sign is present. This is normal. Okay, this is seen at the pleural line. This is also known as ant marching sign. It looks like the ants are marching at a straight line to and fro, and hence it is also known as ant marching sign, and it is normally present in you and me as well if you keep an ultrasound probe on our chest. So this is a normal finding. Okay, when lung sliding sign is absent, this means that the parietal pleura and visceral pleura are not together, because this happens when the visceral and parietal pleura rub against each other. Then you find lung sliding sign. If it is absent, this means that these are not together, which could be seen in cases of pneumothorax. It could be seen in many other cases as well, but to make it simple for you guys, if this is absent, this is suggestive of a pneumothorax. Right. Now, sometimes we see lines which start from the pleural line go to the base of the screen. If this is the screen, they start from the pleural line and go to the base of the screen like comet tail artifacts. Just like in our question, these are known as B lines. When present, these suggest interstitial fluid. It could be seen in pneumonia, in alveolar hemorrhage, it can be seen in pulmonary edema, etc. A lot of aspiration, for example, can also lead to such kind of a picture. A lot of things can lead to this kind of B lines. In case of trauma, this kind of a picture is suggestive of contusion, lung contusion. Right? So these are not normal, especially if there are more than 3 B lines per field. Okay? Then depending on how these B lines are distributed, we can differentiate between some of the etiologies of significant B lines. But at this point you need to understand that B lines, what is the meaning of B lines, which means interstitial fluid, and these could be the various etiologies. One important concept again is that the presence of B lines rules out pneumothorax. Okay, these are not seen in patients with pneumothorax, and even if you are not able to see the lung sliding properly, sometimes it's not very well appreciated, but if you can see B lines there, this means that there is no pneumothorax. You just have to keep this much in mind, right? Coming back to the question now, as we can see that there are a lot of B lines here. Comet tail artifacts starting from the pleural line, going to the base of the screen, going to the base, all the way down to the base. Okay? They can be seen in pneumonia, pulmonary edema, ARDS. They are not seen in pneumothorax. Okay? So this is the right answer. Okay. We come to the next question. Again, an ECG strip. This is a rhythm strip. We don't have the patient history as such, but this ECG strip is quite diagnostic of a condition. And this question asks us to identify the rhythm depicted below. So, as we can see, this is a bradycardia. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the rate is 300/7, which is obviously less than 50 beats per minute, and hence this is bradycardia. Okay. Now we can see that this is regular. QRS complexes are coming regularly. Right? They are at equidistant to each other. They are coming regularly. Okay. So at this point, and these are okay. At this point, we need to go back and visit some concepts as to what are the various causes of bradycardia. Because beyond this, you will not be able to interpret it otherwise. You can see some P waves. There's some. This is a P wave or a T wave. We don't know. There are P waves here. This is a T wave, right? So all messed up. Beyond the QRS complexes, we see all things which are messed up. You need to understand the concept. This is one of the kinds of. This is one of the kinds of an AV block. That is atrioventricular block. This could be of 3 types. First degree, second degree and third degree. So what happens in first degree? So if we have a normal trace here, okay, so this is P, this is QRS, this is T, this is P, this is QRS, this is T. In the first degree AB block, there is a delay from atrium to ventricle. That's it. Okay. So what is demonstrated by this? What demonstrates this delay is a prolonged PR. Right. So now we have this. This is P. PR is prolonged. Then there is R and then there is T. Okay, and the cycle repeats. We have P, prolonged, QRS, T. P, QRS, T. Right? Having noted this, this only has a prolonged PR. All P are transferred, or rather I would say transmitted down to the ventricles, all the impulses. Okay? So every P is followed by a QRS. There has to be this relationship which is maintained. If there is any one drop, like if there is one P, then there is no QRS and there is another P. If there is a drop in the QRS here, this is not first degree heart block. For qualifying as first degree heart block, all the P's have to be transmitted to the QRS. Okay, talking about second degree heart block, some P's transmitted, some P's not transmitted. Okay, so what happens is when we have P, QRS, T, P, QRS, T, P, P. Okay, so here we have a missed QRS beat. So this is an example of second degree heart block. Now this can be of two types. Type 1, type 2. Okay, type 1 is also called, these types are called Mobitz types. Mobitz type 1 and Mobitz type 2. Mobitz type 1 is also called Wenck-Bach phenomena. Just a fancy term, which actually means that PQRST, 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 PQRST. Okay, what's happening here is there is a small PR, then there is a prolonged PR, then there is further prolongation of PR, and then there is a drop. And the cycle starts again. Small, then longer PR. So when there is a lengthening PR, and then followed by a drop, this is Wenck-Bach phenomena. Okay. However, when there is a fixed PR, this is called Mobitz type 2. That is, this fixed PR, right? So PR intervals are fixed here. Sorry. Okay, so we have PR, and then there is drop of QRS, and the cycle repeats. So this is type 2. So only some P's are not transmitted. This is second degree heart block. In the third degree heart block, also known as complete heart block, which means that there is complete AV dissociation, which means that QRS are coming independent and regularly. P waves are coming independent of the QRS complexes. Okay, so these are the P waves. So there are P waves, there are QRS complexes, but these are independent to each other. And hence, there are regular P waves, regular QRS, but no, or I would say changing PR intervals. I would say variably changing. Okay, there is no relationship between, there is no pattern in the PR intervals. Okay, variably changing PR intervals. Okay, important thing to note is that now these are three types of or 3 degrees of AV blocks. Okay, now it may sound a bit complex otherwise, but on the ECG it can be fairly well deciphered. Take a long rhythm strip first of all, and if it is a regular QRS, that is QRS, the R waves are present at regular intervals. This is either first degree or third degree. Okay. Of this, then look at the PR interval. If the PR interval is fixed, this is first degree heart block. If this is variable, this is third degree heart block. Okay. If this is irregular, this is second degree heart block. You look at the PR interval again. If it is fixed or it is increasing. If it is fixed, this is Mobitz type 2. If this is increasing, this is Mobitz type 1. Okay, this is how we approach a patient with heart block, AV block. So now we come back to our question, and now we are sure that this is bradycardia. We have got a rhythm strip. Let's see what is going on. So as we can see, QRS is regular. Okay. So when the QRS is regular, it could be first degree heart block or third degree heart block. As simple as that. Okay. Now we come at the PR interval. So this is the PR interval. 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 This is possibly. So there is no relationship, no proper relationship between P and R, and it's changing continuously. So this is third degree heart block or complete heart block. Okay. On the retrospect, as you can see, we have already made it sure that QRS are regular. Now let's talk about the P waves. This is a P wave for sure. This is a P wave. This is a P wave. This is a P wave. This is a P wave, right? But are they coming regularly? Well, not very apparently on this, mark on, if we count these marks. But if we properly trace them out, this is a P wave. If we properly trace them out at equal intervals, this probably is a P wave, which is hidden with the T wave. You follow it up, this is a T wave, a P wave, sorry, this is a P wave again, this is a P wave, this is a P wave, and we have one P wave which is hidden inside this T wave, hence we are not able to see it separately, and this is a P wave. So we very well have regular P waves and regular QRS complexes which are independent of each other, and there is a bradycardia, hence this is a complete heart block. Okay, so very important concept to understand as to how to approach a patient with heart block. When you suspect heart block, when there is bradycardia, and you see both P and QRS. Okay, this is how you suspect. Then you see at QRS complexes regular, irregular. If it is regular, then it is either first degree or third degree. If it is irregular, it is second degree. Then you see, look at the PR interval. If this is fixed, it's first degree, variable, third degree. PR again, fixed, Mobitz type 2, increasing, Mobitz type 1. Okay, so this is how you approach. Okay. We come to the question number 63. You are a doctor posted in a district health center. At 6 a.m., a lady brings her 4-year-old child, saying she saw a black colored snake slither by the side of the child when she woke up. The mother also expresses her concern that she finds the child limp. You examine the child, who appears drowsy and is drooling. You do not find any fang marks as such. How would you proceed further? Okay. So this looks like a case of a neurotoxic snake bite. But how do you explain not finding fang marks or any local signs? So, usually neurotoxicity is seen commonly with crate bites, which are notorious for having no or minimal fang site clinical features. So much so that even a sleeping person may not wake up after a bite. Okay, so this is a typical scenario. So typically a patient who presents to the emergency department early in the morning saying that he was very well in the night, slept well in the night, and got up and is having features of neuroparalysis, right? Especially if there's bulbar paralysis and descending kind of paralysis kind of a picture after sleeping on the floor. Among other things, you should always consider a crate bite. That's a neurotoxic snake bite into your differential diagnosis. Okay. In this, the mother or the informant, who was informant, also saw a black colored snake slither, which makes the diagnosis very likely. Okay. So this is a typical case of neurotoxic snake bite. So what would you do next? You reassure the mother that there is nothing to worry and keep the child under observation? No, this is wrong. So you have to do something, right? So when do you do something? The treatment of choice is an anti-snake venom. Or it's ASV, which is active, which is actually a polyvalent serum, active against crate, cobra, viper. That means Russell's viper and saw-scaled viper. These are the big 4 snakes which are seen and responsible for symptomatic snake bites in India. And the polyvalent snake anti-snake venom is active against these 4 snakes. There are other important snakes like hump-nose pit viper, etc., or Himalayan pit viper, which are new additions to the big 4. And unfortunately, the anti-snake venom is not active against the other species of snakes as of now. Okay, so the treatment of choice is polyvalent anti-snake venom, ASV. What are the indications for starting an ASV? If the patient has evidence of systemic envenomation, That is either neurologic clinical features, presence of bleeding, presence of a kidney injury because of hemoglobinuria, myoglobinuria, or because of muscle destruction and causing an AKI, rhabdomyolysis causing an AKI. Okay, so these are the typical clinical features. Of the neurological clinical features, earliest of the signs is ptosis. Okay, also a neck drop may be seen. These are common things. The second important thing is just to mention that these are systemic signs of clinical systemic envenomation of the laboratory parameters if there is coagulation abnormality, coagulopathy on labs. This is again a second sign of systemic envenomation and is an indication for starting ASV. So this is usually important for hematotoxic or hemotoxic snake bites. Okay, these signs could be traditional signs like PTINR, thrombocytopenia, etc. Or in the resource limited settings, there is something which we do is 20-minute whole blood clotting test. Okay, what we do is that we take a clean glass vial or a bottle, take 5 to 7 ml of blood and keep it still for 20 minutes. Okay, we take some blood and keep it still for 20 minutes. At the end of 20 minutes, we gently tilt the bottle or the vial or the syringe, not the syringe exactly, the vial or the bottle, and see whether the blood has clotted or not. We see for clotting. If the blood has clotted by now, we have a negative whole blood clotting time. If the blood is still free and not clotted, we have a WBCT which is positive and it is suggestive of envenomation. This is a crude test. This is not a very foolproof test and is used if PTINR and other parameters of coagulation abnormalities, if they are not present, if these tests are not present, even at the primary healthcare center and the peripheral centers where these tests are not available, WBCT can be 20-minute whole blood clotting test can still be done and can be used to take a decision regarding administering ASV, anti-snake venom. Okay. Now these are the systemic indications for giving an ASV. Now when do we consider ASV? If it is a local sign, right? So if the patient has a snake bite on the leg, there is a fang marks here, and there are some local signs. So what forms an indication for giving an ASV? First is rapidly progressive swelling. Okay, if more than half of the limb is involved in less than 48 hours, or if there is a rapid swelling progression, or rather to quantify, if the swelling crosses two major joints within hours. This becomes a second important indication for giving an ASV. Third important indication is regional tender lymphadenopathy. Okay, so if any of these local signs are present or any of the systemic signs are present, these become an indication for starting an ASV. Now in our patient, our child who is presented with no significant local signs and symptoms, but with a limp and drooling, okay, this becomes a systemic envenomation and you need to give ASV. Okay, so reassuring, yes, you have to reassure, but this is not the only thing which you have to do. You have to also treat the patient. As far as whole blood clotting time is concerned, And this is done when the patient as such is asymptomatic, but not the patient who has a neuroparalysis on presentation. Okay, so this is not helpful in such a patient. You need to consider administering anti-snake venom immediately. That is correct. Okay, you give dextrose to the patient. Well, maybe the patient is drooling and is drowsy. Checking an RBS would be a very prudent thing. And if the patient has a child has a low RBS, maybe you can consider giving dextrose. Okay. Well, especially in children, you do not consider 50% dextrose. You usually consider a maximum of 25% dextrose as such, even if you had to give. But the best answer for this question would be to administer an anti-snake venom immediately. Now, some points as to consider, which are to consider when administering ASV, is that you do not do skin testing. There is no role of skin testing here. Okay, the next is that this is mixed in D5. Okay, so for the dose, it would be 8 to 10 vials. ASV is given in 100 ml of D5 and given over 30 to 60 minutes. Preferably over 60 minutes, it's given as a continuous infusion. Okay. Recently, it has also been recommended to pre-treat the patients with H1, H2 blockers or subcutaneous epinephrine. This decreases the adverse effects, the allergic effects, decreases the allergic complications of ASV. Okay. Now, what if the patient develops an allergy? Now, the ASV is so important that it cannot be stopped as such. So, even if the patient develops a severe allergy to ASV, you temporarily stop it. Stop temporarily. Treatment of the allergy is given. And when there is slight improvement, you restart ASV. Okay, but this is because ASV is such an important medication, and snake envenomation is easily reversible, and it's a very important potent medication to be given. Okay, hence we don't stop at the development of allergy if it is an anti-snake venom. Okay, so the correct answer is D. Now we come to the next question, again, which is an important decision tree which you all should know. This is a 4-year-old boy who presents to the emergency after ingesting a button battery. I would rather mention a button battery here. Button battery. This figure shows an abdominal plus chest radiograph of this patient. What would be the recommended treatment? Okay. So now for this you need to understand that foreign body ingestion is life-threatening. That's one statement as such, of which button battery is a serious business. Why? Because it can cause mucosal injury as early as 2 hours after ingestion. And we are not even talking about airway foreign bodies, we are talking about GI foreign bodies. Foreign bodies can be life-threatening, especially if they are aspirated in the airway. Right? But button batteries are bad even for the GI tract, right from the esophagus to further down. So we have to be very, very cautious about button battery ingestion patients. Okay, so we'll go to the algorithm as to how do we approach a patient with a button battery ingestion. Okay. Yeah. So First of all, we need to see whether the patient requires resuscitation. Okay. So, which is similar to any other foreign body. If the patient needs resuscitation, you need to follow the BLS algorithm. Okay? If there is a partial airway obstruction, actually it is called partial foreign body airway obstruction, you need to encourage cough. Okay? If there is complete foreign body airway obstruction, then depending on the patient whether he is conscious or unconscious now. For conscious patients, you need to go ahead and do Heimlich maneuver. Or abdominal thrusts. For unconscious patient, you need to start chest compressions. And there is an algorithm which is based on BLS. We will not be discussing that in detail. Okay, so this is done in BLS. If there is no resuscitation required, we will ask the next question, that is the patient symptomatic because of this button battery ingestion. Okay, so the button battery symptoms could be chest pain. I'll change the color of the pen here. This could be chest pain, severe abdominal pain, cough, fever due to mediastinitis, recurrent vomiting, hematemesis, etc. Okay, any of these symptoms if it is present, if the patient is symptomatic, yes, then you do a radiographic localization and then emergent removal. This could be done endoscopically or surgically. Okay, either ways an emergent removal is be required, right? Okay, if the patient is not symptomatic, now we consider timing of ingestion. Just a second, let me clean up the board. Okay, now considering the timing of ingestion, if it is within 2 hours or witnessed by the provider, you should immediately give 5 to 10 ml of pure honey. And mind you, this is a recent study which has come up, and in addition to the recommendations, which is not very old, this is a recent recommendation, and this is contrary to the previous suggestion and recommendation that you should not give anything by mouth after a patient who has taken or ingested a button battery. That was previously recommended, but now it is recommended that if it is within 2 hours or if it is witnessed in front of a person, a 5 to 10 ml of pure honey should be given immediately. When the patient is then brought to the emergency department, an X-ray is done, and if it shows an esophageal position, you go ahead and repeat the honey, or you may consider sucralfate. Okay, repeated dosing can be given here. Okay, if the timing is more than 2 hours or unknown, then the next important decision point is X-ray localization, and this should be done from nasopharynx to anus. Since multiple foreign bodies can be found, multiple button batteries can also be found. Hence, we don't want to miss them once we are evaluating a patient, and we need to go ahead and do a complete radiographic evaluation from nasopharynx to the anus. Now, two important locations are esophagus and gastric location. Okay, if it is esophagus, it is recommended that emergent endoscopy is done and the button battery is removed, irrespective of whatever time the button battery has been in place. And also simultaneously mucosa should be evaluated. Mucosal evaluation should be done to see for any injury. And if there is any injury, you need to admit the patient right away. If it is a gastric location, now till the decision point here, till we have discussed, this is very well evidence based. Okay, this is evidence based and the guidelines are crisp on this. But what we are going to discuss about the gastric location, there are a lot of controversies here. But let's discuss what is the popular consensus. And one of the pathways, one of the guidelines which suggests is that once you have localized it into the stomach, further management depends on the age and the size of the battery. So now you look at the battery diameter. If you can determine the battery diameter by history or by examining the corroborative evidence, if it is more than 20 millimeter, it could be less than 20 millimeter. If it is more than 20 millimeter, if it is less than 20 millimeter, you manage it at home. Manage at home with weekly radiographs. But if at 14 days still in stomach, you do an endoscopic removal. Okay. If it is more than 20 millimeter and the age is more than 5, you repeat X-rays at 48 hours. Endoscopy should be done and removal should be done if still in stomach. Okay. If the age is less than 5, it should be removed immediately. Okay. So this is in short the algorithm for button battery ingestion. We'll discuss it once again in short. If there is a need for resuscitation, do it. Next step would be to consider symptoms. If the patient is symptomatic, remove it. Okay, if the patient is not symptomatic and it was like recently ingested in the form of within 2 hours or witness ingestion, you give honey and repeat doses of honey are recommended. Endoscopic removal may be done if this does not dislodge the button battery from esophagus down into the lower GI tract then. Okay, if the timing of ingestion is delayed, if the ingestion was done some time back, that is more than 2 hours, or if the time is unknown, X-ray should be used for localization. If it is in esophagus, it should be removed urgently. If it is in stomach, the further management depends on the size of the patient, size of the battery and age of the patient. Okay. If it is lower down, that is beyond stomach, If it is beyond stomach, then you can have management at home. Okay, similar to a small button battery in the stomach. Okay, so this is how you go about it. Now we come back to our question and see what we have here. So we have a young boy with a button battery injection with a radiograph which shows that this button battery is in the stomach. Okay. So this is less than 5 years of age, with probably an asymptomatic child with a button battery in stomach. So it can be either managed with, depending on the size of the battery. It's not very clear as to on the X-ray whether this should be considered as less than 20 millimeters or more than 20 millimeters. But if the information is not available, we need to consider the worst possibility, that is a large battery, button battery, which is more than 20 millimeters in size. In that case, we have to prepare for an emergent endoscopy depending on the algorithm. Had this been mentioned that it's less than 20 millimeters in size, then maybe repeat abdominal X-rays may be considered in such a patient with a management at home. Okay. Okay. So we come to the next question now. Right. We come back to again another one of the ECG questions. If the patient presented to the emergency department with chest pain and has the following ECG, which of the following is correct? Which of the following are correct except? Okay, so this ECG grossly shows a lot of ST elevations at various leads. I can see a lot of ST elevations here. So this is ST elevations in the inferior leads, in the septal leads, septal and anterior leads, with the reciprocal ST depression in the lead AVL and lead 1. So this is suggestive of an inferior STEMI. Okay, because we have an inferior wall 2, 3 AVF, we have ST elevations with a reciprocal T-wave inversion, ST depression in lead AVL. Okay. Now, one of the important considerations in patients with inferior STEMI is the presence of right ventricular myocardial infarction. Okay, so this is also one of the important complications. This is associated with higher mortality. And the treatment is also different. As this is a preload dependent condition, in most of the myocardial infarctions, we give nitrates and morphine for pain relief and to decrease the venous return, especially if the patient has pulmonary edema. But this is not so in cases of right ventricular myocardial infarction, because if we give nitrates or morphine, etc., they will decrease the venous return and thereby can precipitate a shock-like situation. Okay, and they are very deleterious if we give them in right ventricular myocardial infarction. So it's important to diagnose RVMI before starting therapy, and this should be a concern, especially if you are having an inferior STEMI on the ECG. So how can you suspect it? So the best thing, or the best way to diagnose right ventricular myocardial infarction is to get right-sided leads, which means if this is the midline, normally the ECG leads are placed on the left side. Similar alignment is kept on the right side of the patient to get the right-sided chest leads. Okay, of this, V4R is an important lead. If we see an ST elevation in V4R, this is quite suggestive of right ventricular myocardial infarction. Okay, that is one thing. But we don't have any V4R here. We just have 12 leads. So can we suspect myocardial infarction, which is right ventricular myocardial infarction, in a 12 lead ECG? Yes, we can. Along with an inferior STEMI, if we find ST elevation in AVR, in lead V1, this is quite suggestive of right ventricular MI. Okay, so in this patient, we can, by confidently say that, to some extent, we can say that this is an inferior STEMI for sure, but also has a right ventricular extension, and hence associated RVMI is there. Which of the following is wrong? Do not administer nitrates? Correct. We won't, because this is a suspected right ventricular MI. Do you need to consider IV fluids for hypotension? Yes. Inform the cath lab immediately for PCI? Correct, because this is anyway the STEMI and the treatment of choice is primary PCI. Avoid giving clopidogrel? No. This is not a correct statement, because clopidogrel is not contraindicated in patients with right ventricular MI. And you can very well go ahead and you should give clopidogrel before shifting a patient for PCI. Hence, the wrong statement is D, and that would be the correct option for our question.